Right, I think the numbers have settled. So it's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to introduce Matt Betts. Matt started out life doing his PhD at the University of New Brunswick and then moved on to Dartmouth College to do a postdoc, and has subsequently been at the Oregon State University, I guess, for quite some time now, Matt. And he is the professor of landscape ecology. He's based in the College of Forestry. And Matt's work is just really critical, I think, in laying out that interface between how we manage forestry and the degradation that occurs in landscapes and what the impacts of that are for wildlife populations, wildlife movement, etc. And his work has been largely focused in the US, but he's also had some substantial and exciting pieces of work and elsewhere, and his work's of great relevance to all of the issues we face globally. So, Matt, without further ado, really looking forward to your talk, and thanks so much for speaking.
Well, thanks, David, and thanks for organizing this, and also to Dom for convincing me to do this talk today. And thanks to all of you for showing up. I'm going to give you just an overview of some work that we've been doing, particularly focused on forest management as relevant to the center at Cambridge. And hopefully we can have some discussion at the end. So that's no fun. Okay, well, you're looking at a photo of an Oregon managed forest in the background here. And today I'm going to talk about multiple forestry in multiple parts of the world, as David said, ranging from Oregon to Canada and even into the tropics as well. So just to give you some background on sort of the focus of at least part of my career, is this conundrum that as human population has been growing, we see brown wood production and wood demand growing in lockstep with human population growth. So how do we balance that sort of consumption with all of the other species that live on the planet? About 8 million species. So a lot of my work has happened in New Brunswick, and I'll show you some slides from there later on, but this is a global issue. And it seems that without that much planning at global scales anyway, the way humans are trying to solve this problem is by growing wood intensively. And so what you're looking at here is the growth in plantations globally. By plantations, these are generally single species crops of trees that are not so similar to native forest. And this is just some mapping that we did globally a couple of years ago that shows that the footprint of managed forests worldwide is massive. What you're looking at here is a gradient from blue, which is sort of unmanaged, maybe protected forests, through yellow, which are highly intensively managed forests worldwide. And then the red and pink are areas of forest loss. And you don't need much imagination to see that the footprint of managed forests globally, especially intensively managed forests, is substantial and therefore likely to have quite significant impacts on biodiversity. So today I'm going to talk about an experiment that we've been conducting now for 15 years on the degree to which managing forests intensively, like I've shown you, affects biodiversity, and whether there are trade-offs between timber production and biodiversity. I'm going to talk about some work we've been doing on how to quantify forest degradation at regional scales in the temperate zone, something we're calling the triad approach, which is landscape level planning as a potential solution. And then looking forward, some work that we're hoping to do in collaboration with David, actually, and Gianluca and Andrew Balford, focused on a global approach to thinking about forest conservation and forest management. Okay, so first chapter, trade-offs between timber production and biodiversity. I don't know how much people in the UK know about this, but very commonly in North America and across the boreal in Europe, herbicides are used in forest management. And the reason for this is to suppress competing vegetation with conifer crop trees. In the West, the US, the crop tree is Douglas fir. And so quite a lot of herbicides are used in these areas to suppress plants that compete with Douglas fir. Um, and it works, you'll see in a minute. The downside is that there are sometimes direct effects on biodiversity, bee deaths, for example, you can see in a news article on the left. And also, there's a smoking gun of there being carcinogenic effects of some of these sprays. And the World Health Organization has actually listed Roundup or glyphosate as a probable cause of cancer. But nevertheless, these sprays are used extensively across the world. This is just a picture of what herbicides do over the kind of medium term. In panel A, you can see a lot of deciduous broadleaf vegetation interspersed with Douglas fir, the conifer, and that's where no herbicide has been sprayed. And panel B is a very intensively managed Douglas fir plantation on Weyerhaeuser ground here in Oregon. So what's the effect of shifting from a management regime like A to B on both biodiversity and wood production? So does biodiversity decline with increased timber production? And usually when I'm giving this talk in person, I ask people to develop predictions about what they might expect to see. Are there trade-offs? Are there kind of neutral effects of producing timber at the local scale? Or maybe, with greater productivity, you see enhanced biodiversity on these stands. So what we did, and this was a really tricky thing to do, but we implemented this region scale manipulative experiment focused on herbicide application and forest management intensity. And I want you to pay attention to these colors, green control, blue light, orange moderate, and red intensive. And this was what we call a randomized block design. So these 4 treatments were randomly applied across these 8 experimental blocks or 8 landscapes across Oregon. And these areas were clear cut in 2009, and then they were sprayed with a variety of different intensities of spray. The control, after a lot of negotiation, had 0 herbicide sprayed. The light was kind of what's more common on state lands here. The moderate is sort of the industrial standard. That's actually 3 herbicide sprays. You can see the conifers poking up there, coming in strongly as a result of no spray. And the intensive is beyond what most do, but some had intended to do. And we've nicknamed it the Mordor treatment because it was so severe. And you can see the only green in that picture in 2011 are these Douglas fir growing back. And I should say this has been a long-term study, so it's enabled us to look at biodiversity and tree growth over now 15 years. So you can see how things have changed quite dramatically to the point where it's difficult to get a good photo of these stands. They're so thick. And I have a master's student, Aidan Place, who's going to be going in this year to outfit all these sites with bioacoustics recorders. So just to give you a very quick overview of the study, then we have these 4 management treatments replicated in 8 blocks across the Oregon Coast Range. We then went out, and we still do, and we measured trees and shrub response. We measure plant response, and we'll call these direct biodiversity effects because these herbicides are designed to kill herbaceous plants and deciduous trees. And then we went out and we've measured moths using light traps, arthropods using sweep nets and pitfall traps, ungulates using camera traps, pollinators using flower watches and sweep nets, and birds using point counts and now bioacoustics. And the fact that I just described that to you in about, 30 seconds would make a lot of my field assistants very angry, and hopefully none of them are watching. But in total, we ended up with 140,000 detections of 835 taxa. We no longer do this level of intensive biodiversity survey. We've retreated to just plants and birds, but it's still an ongoing long-term study. All right, well, does biodiversity decline with increased timber production? These are just some of the expected results. For woody plants, we see huge differences in abundance between places that were heavily sprayed, the orange and the red, in relation to the control, which is the green. Herbaceous plants follow a similar pattern with the controls having many more species and higher abundance. Flowers actually a counterintuitive result, but this is because many of the flowers in the intensively managed stands were invasives, which tend to do a lot better under herbicide because the niches are opened by reduction of competition. And richness follows a similar pattern, and I'm not showing it to you, but we also looked at turnover by beta diversity, and we see similar effects. So those are the expected results. No surprise, the scientists are finding that if you spray herbicides designed to kill plants, you will see fewer plants. Money well spent. But we also saw quite strong effects on bird abundance and diversity. Again, you can see that, and we split this out into years 1 to 4, because that's the period of time we expected herbicides to have the strongest effect on the plant community, which propagates up through trophic cascades to affect birds. That effect was dampened after about year 5 to the point where abundance and richness were similar, but some species still did very poorly in the intensively managed stands. Bees showed very little difference in abundance, but species richness was higher in control sites. Arthropods, a similar effect to bees. Moths, very surprisingly, actually, we saw non-significant effects of these herbicide treatments on species richness. They're all very specialized. We get 500 species of moths here in the Coast Range, so we really expected to see quite strong effects, but we did not. You can read the paper to find out why. And our camera traps didn't really show big differences in the number of detections of deer and Roosevelt elk. So overall, then, it's still not a fantastic picture for biodiversity with 18% fewer species. Most of these reductions were driven by plants, pollinators, and birds. So now, do we actually grow trees faster as a result of these sprays? Surprisingly, the results weren't quite as strong in this direction as was expected by managers. The controls, people expected, we would actually need special permission from the state in order to do these treatments because they thought there'd be complete regeneration failure, and that was not the case. On the x-axis here, this is yield in board feet, which is the standard way of measuring timber here in the West. You can see the dots aren't that different, right? Just all over 50,000 board feet. This is projected out, by the way, to rotation age. And the intensive treatments are only growing about 19% and 22% more wood. Of course, this means that if you want the same amount of wood without spray, you would need to spread the impact of your harvest out by the same amount, 22% more land cut. The effects do get a little bit stronger when we model timber production out to 50 and 60 years, but I should say typically in the Northwest here, rotation age to the year at which these trees are cut is at 40 years. Okay, so just a quick summary then. This is work from Urs Korman, who's now faculty in science at the Swiss Ornithological Institute. And he looked at quantified these trade-off relationships for species richness, but also abundance and turnover. All results were similar. So we do see a trade-off between timber yield and species richness for woody plants. If they're solid lines, there's significant relationships. We see trade-offs with herbs, with arthropods, with pollinators, with birds in the first period. Flowers, no, not moths, as I indicated, and then birds, we don't see a trade-off in the later periods of the study. So again, I encourage you to look at these papers if you're actually interested in some of these results in more detail. So overall, those of you who are feeling pessimistic can feel venerated. About 5 of these major taxonomic groups showed trade-offs, but then the rest did not show these big trade-off effects. So in some ways, these results after massive amounts of study were not as pronounced as we expected them to be, but nevertheless, there are trade-offs. Just a very brief, I can't leave this out because it was so much work. I feel like I have to give it some justice here, but we also, across this full gradient, across the 32 stands we had, we erected these exclosures to test the effects of deer and elk, the ecosystem services or disservices they might provide for these intensively managed stands. And also we put netting up on 1/2 of these exclosures and tested whether the ecosystem services provided by birds in terms of eating arthropods, herbivorous arthropods, shifted across a forest management intensity gradient. So you can see the green netting there in the background. That was 4 years of keeping birds out of these stands as they regenerated. And the answer was birds do provide an ecosystem service. Deer and elk also do. Interestingly, they actually work as a sort of herbicide, trimming down trees in between, or trimming down the competing vegetation in between the trees. And so Thomas Stokely, a postdoc of mine, looked at all these ecosystem services across the treatments. And hopefully you recognize the different colors here as the different treatments, green being the control. And overall, many more ecosystem services provided in the control sites compared to the intensively managed sites, except, of course, the intensively managed sites grew timber at a faster rate. Okay, so with that, you can take a breather. I know I'm moving through this quite quickly, but this is an exciting time to talk about projects we've done in the past here in the US. The prognosis for doing projects like this in the future is low, so I have to really rest on my laurels and enjoy the time I spent doing science. Sorry, a little pessimism there. So next we're going to talk about the effects of intensive forest management at regional scales. And for this, I'm going to take you to my home province in Canada. I'm going to talk about something that reviewers of our papers have had trouble understanding. And I apologize if this seems a little on the simple side. Okay, we had to draw these diagrams to explain it. So deforestation is when you cut down a forest and replace it with some other cover type. So in this case, farm or suburbia. But deforestation isn't the only thing of interest to global conservation. And you probably, some of you know at least, that there are new policies proposed for the EU that actually focus on forest degradation as well as forest loss or deforestation. And this has put many North Americans at great unease because nobody really knows how to define degradation. And if there are going to be import restrictions based on this, it could be quite important for countries like Canada. Maybe not for the US now because we have these fun tariffs in place. So this is the area where I grew up in Eastern Canada on the left. And you can see this interesting signature in the Global Forest Watch data of a purpley color. So I should say pink is loss, blue is gain, and purple is actually loss, then gain. So what does this mean if you have a forest that's lost and then suddenly seems to come back quickly? It seems to be a signature of intensive forest management where you're growing trees on a rather quick rotation. And you can see in the North American shot, there are some serious areas across the Pacific Northwest and northern Canada and the Southeast that have this signature of what we think is really intensive forest management, rapid loss and gain. And so from my home province in Canada, this is the pattern we've seen over decades. Mature mixed forest, this beautiful Acadian forest, we call it, sugar maple and beech, but that's mixed with conifers like red spruce and white pine, etc. And over many years, these have been clear cut and then planted with trees, generally a single species, or they're left to regenerate on their own, in which case they still come back very differently. They come back as intolerant hardwoods like white birch, etc. And if you manage them on a fast enough rotation, they never go back to this mature mixed forest. And how do I know this? Well, it's partly my fault. This is a picture of me back in, my gosh, 1992, and I paid for my university education by putting these monocultures in the ground. This is black spruce up in northern Ontario. So what is degradation then? Degradation, we argue, in the temperate zone at least, is clear cutting and then either planting on the top series of images or letting it naturally regenerate and turn to species that are not from the original species mix, kind of these early sterile, intolerant hardwood species, very different. And we know these practices have been really common across this whole part of Eastern Canada, clear cutting and plantation. You can see in the pink and the purple. And then to map these clear cuts and plantations over time across these three provinces, you can see that the footprint is substantial. But importantly, forest cover has not changed across this region. In fact, it's actually increased. So if the import penalty was only in deforestation, this area would be thumbs up. So we're interested in asking whether or not this degradation has affected bird habitat. And as you probably all know, this is kind of now a classic paper by Ken Rosenberg and others showing that North American birds have been declining rapidly. So we asked, is forest degradation causing a reduction in habitat for Eastern Canadian birds? And is this degradation resulting in population declines? And so just some background. I've been for a long time now interested in species distribution models, but not at broad scales, more at regional scales to try and get at the effects of habitat fragmentation. So this goes all the way back to my PhD, but here's a paper from 2014 where we compared these distribution models for different species and looked at fragmentation effects. So I just want to highlight these two species. This is black burning warbler. Dark colors are high probability of occurrence, light colors are low probability of occurrence. And to show you how important it is to map landscapes from the perspective of these species at fine resolutions, this is the outline of Fundy National Park in black. It's a protected area. The areas with white are industrial forestry. Look at this species. The difference is just remarkable. Okay, so the argument we have is that if you're going to understand fragmentation from and habitat loss from the perspective of birds, you really need to be thinking about individual species and their habitat affinities. So no surprises, but many people don't do it at all, right? They just look at forest loss effects. These are both forest birds, by the way. So to try and upscale these sorts of models to the scale of all three provinces, we use these black dots here from the Maritimes Breeding Bird Survey, about 11,000 points collected across this region. I'll talk about the orange squiggles in a minute. And then we use Landsat data, the raw bands, and machine learning approaches to map distributions of 54 common species. And the little twist to this is that we went beyond stuff that I'd done much in the past, and we used an approach called the continuous change detection classification. And this is not just using reflectances from Landsat bands, but it's using the temporal signature and reflectance to get additional information about forest type and trends in forest management. So for example, say oaks leaf out later than aspen. This signature would show you that that was happening. And if that's relevant to birds, you'd pick that up. And also, a clear cut that's intensively managed might green up more slowly than one that's not. So that's information that can be included in these covariates. So anyway, I won't talk more about that, but it's been really fun. And I want to credit my collaborator Young, or Zikang Yang, for really doing most of that work in Google Earth Engine. So I just wanted to show you data that forest amount across this region has not changed. Okay, so if you're looking for deforestation effects, you're not going to see them. And these provinces are very proud of the fact that forest cover is actually increasing over time. Now I'm going to show you habitat for one of my favorite warbler species. David, have you seen this one? Just nod if you have. If you haven't, you need to come
Absolutely.
over and see it. Okay, so brilliant warbler, migrates all the way to Brazil and lives in these old, ancient Eastern Canadian forests, nests in that red spruce you can see on the side there. And so what you're going to see now is a movie of our distribution model. Yellow is habitat and blue is not habitat. And what we did was we backcast, because Landsat goes all the way back to 85, we can backcast habitat change. And this is an area we're hoping that, or an approach we're hoping we can apply more globally. So you can see, if you look carefully, the yellow light kind of going off, can't you? And really the only yellow patches you can see in that image are areas that are formally protected, or not the only ones, but the predominant ones. 33% habitat loss over 35 years, which is quite remarkable. And then I'm going to show you this sporeal chickadee, which has a really different distribution. You can see it to the northern part of the province. And again, a striking effect of these forestry practices on its habitat. Remember, forest cover is not changing at all, just habitat amount. And so we see this pattern to be quite common. A gradient from green to red means you're going from habitat to habitat loss. And 66% of these 54 species have lost habitat since 85. And that effect is even amplified in the recent decade and a half. So just to show you these results again in kind of linear terms in relation to forest amount, these are some of the species that have lost habitat at the greatest rates. So if you're good scientists, which I expect you all are, you will be asking, well, those are nice maps, but are they relevant in any way to actual bird populations? And so this is where the Breeding Bird Survey for North America came in. Those are the orange squiggles. And we asked the question, if you've lost habitat along these Breeding Bird Survey routes, you should see changes in abundance over the long term. So with this independent data set, we were actually able to test, does more habitat mean more individuals? Does losing habitat mean we're losing individuals? And using a hierarchical model I won't go into detail about, the answer is these models perform surprisingly well at predicting abundance and then also abundance change over the long term. And some of these species have been declining like crazy as a function of this habitat change and management intensification over time. So these were some of the top species that showed strong associations with our predictive models. Okay, so if you want more, you can read this paper, which was our first attempt at looking at forest degradation from an avian perspective. And hopefully I've convinced you that the changing forest from mature mixed forest to these different types is resulting in population changes for these species. So, I've shown you so far that intensive management shows trade-offs with biodiversity. I've shown you that if you do this kind of intensive management at regional scales, you see long-term declines in biodiversity. So really what's necessary is some sort of landscape scale planning to prevent these biodiversity declines, but also think about how to manage these trade-offs between biodiversity and wood production, because it doesn't look like humans are using any less wood than they have in the past. And those actually, it's expected that production will increase by about 50% over the coming decades. So this is where something that's been called the triad approach has come in. And I thought this would be fun for all of you to hear about because it does map on very closely to some work that's been done at Cambridge on land sharing versus sparing. So very briefly then, in agriculture, there have been these two sort of broad level approaches to thinking about how to manage trade-offs between agricultural production and biodiversity. And the land sparing approach proposes that we have reserves and sorry, losing battery on my laptop, which is not good. We have reserves and then we grow food using intensive approaches that reduces the total amount of area needed to grow food. On the other hand, the land sharers are those who argue that, well, that's not quite right. What we need to do is to do organic agriculture, much softer agriculture. Generally, these come with yield penalties. And so the problem has been that there's the expectation that production is spread out over broader landscapes. But that's okay because these approaches are softer. All right, I know I'm telling you things you already know, so I'll keep it short. So Ben Phelan, who actually came over and worked with me in Oregon for 3 or 4 years, published this cool PhD chapter. It's nice when your PhD ends up in science, and found quite strong support for the land sparing approach in agriculture. And then somebody you might know quite well, David, has been one of the first people to look at sharing and sparing in managed forest landscapes, in this case in the tropics. But there really hasn't been a lot of work done on these general concepts in managed forest landscapes worldwide, aside from David's and a few others. So most sharing sparing studies have been done in the tropics. It's quite reasonable to expect that results in forests in terms of sparing versus sharing could be quite different to agriculture. Many of these areas that are clear-cut are still habitat for a wide number of species, unlike some agricultural landscapes where you're just not going to get many, especially mature forest species in managed agricultural landscapes, even if they are sharing landscapes. So in forest systems, there are potentially greater opportunity for a gradient of options. You can imagine gradients in management intensity rather than thinking about kind of it's agriculture or it's not agriculture. So I'm going to walk you through this a bit slowly because this one's important. What you're seeing here on the left side is a panel with sharing on the left, some intermediate or triad approach in the middle, and land sparing on the right. And dark green is unmanaged forests or reserve, light green is ecological forestry, and red is high yield. And then on the y-axis of this panel, you can see arbitrary production target ranging from 20 to double that 40. The important take home is that in the land sparing approach, you can afford more reserve because you're growing wood intensively in the red. And that is the opposite in the land sharing approach with not that much reserve, but most of the landscape is in this nice ecological forestry. So the question is, which of these sorts of scenarios has the best outcomes for biodiversity? And the pictures, by the way, are intensively managed forest and in Oregon here, an ecological forestry, kind of thinning, and then unmanaged old growth Douglas fir. So a while back, this is maybe 6, 7 years ago, a bunch of us got together and developed hypotheses about how these different triad treatments, remember this is landscape level, affect a variety of outcomes, ranging from endangered species through early seral species, social acceptability, on and on, carbon storage. And the proposal was then we actually had this opportunity in Western Oregon to have this huge forest, about 35,000 hectares, that would be devoted to a research idea. And we proposed to the governor at the time that we actually do an experimental landscape level test of the triad approach. And if you want to know about that, it was described in this short article in Nature. And so what sub-watersheds were attributed to a variety of these triad treatments. And I won't walk you through this in detail, but these range from pure ecological forestry, so the entire watershed is managed ecologically, through these intermediate options of triad approaches, through an intensive or a sparing approach with 50% in plantation and 50% in reserve. And again, this was meant to be experimental and long-term. And we attributed all these sub-watersheds to these different treatments. The left-hand side was a really cool conservation win. And one of my subversive reasons for trying to encourage policymakers to consider it, because yeah, somehow policymakers agreed that the whole western side of this area be attributed to a conservation reserve. So aside from some initial restoration treatments, it will remain not part of the study, and no harvests will occur. So just some pictures of these different treatments at the stand level. This is some old growth forest within the Elliott. There's not a lot of it left because some of it burnt, but we still have a lot of unmanaged 150-year-old forest or so. Again, intensive management and ecological forestry. So as a first attempt then, a PhD student of mine, Scott Harris, who has a forestry background, worked with a landscape level simulation model that actually goes all the way back to my undergrad, called Woodstock. And we developed this to test these different triad approaches without having to collect 40 or 50 years of data. So this is just sort of hypothesis generating in a way. And these sorts of models require detailed information about how abundance of different species respond to these treatments, but also over time. And this is the tricky bit. Not many people have this. And then also how timber yield varies over time in relation to different treatments. And so we're able to use this linear programming model, which is an optimization program, to run various simulations based on the different proportions of these treatments, different triad treatments in the landscape, and then make projections as to how species will respond and how yield will respond. So yeah, I won't talk about that for a sec. So this is a spatially explicit model, and you can see 2020, the existing distribution of forest. The white is just kind of hasn't been attributed a treatment yet. The green is this reserve I was telling you about. And then by 2120, we can project forward in time as to under these different triad treatments to see what happens. And so these are the kinds of results Scott was getting. We can look at which of the sparing, sharing, or triad approaches enhance carbon the most, or result in complex vertical structure in a stand, or have complex canopy, or have habitat for this endangered species of bird, marbled murrelet, that nests in old growth and forages in the ocean. So generally, the take home from this paper was that actually a sparing approach was better for most of our response variables. For some species, it wasn't. This hermit warbler, which likes complex forests, the result from ecological forestry tended to do better in those triad scenarios. Willow flycatcher was an interesting one. It's an early seral species, and it didn't do well in the land sharing approach because there wasn't enough early seral forest out there, not enough clear cutting for this flycatcher. All right, just looking forward now, and I think I'm nearly out of time. We have this fantastic PhD student, Maggie Hellred, who's now going out and basically collecting pre-data across the whole Elliott and 210 points. And Gianluca is working with Maggie to develop similar models, but for not just birds and forest structure, but also bats, arthropods, fungi, um, camera trap mammals, and bees. And what am I missing? I think of, oh, herbaceous plants as well. So it's been an epic effort to collect all of these data. Um, these are the points where Maggie's collected her data. And then Gianluca, who's postdoc here, will be looking at gradients in time across treatments to see how species respond to those, and then including them in another landscape level model. Oh, I just wanted to point out that these data don't come free of cost. It's just incredibly difficult terrain to get through. All right, finally, next steps. So most of what I've talked to you about has been at stand level, landscape level, or regional scale. And an important question then is, are there more interesting and effective ways of providing wood for society if we think about these issues at global scales? And so, it could be, for example, that the right answer to what proportion of these different treatments, intensive, ecological, and reserve, varies depending on where you are on Earth. It could be that in the temperate zone, for example, land sparing is a more commonly useful thing to do. But in the tropics, where species aren't used to conversion to, these intensively managed plantations, or aren't used to having roads punched into the forest that enable hunting, that maybe a sparing approach would be better. And some of the ideas for this, at least for me, came from a paper we did a number of years ago that shows that the effect of fragmentation varies quite tremendously across latitudinal gradients, with areas at high latitude showing a lower proportion of species that are fragmentation sensitive. Excuse me, that's the line you see here. So yeah, a strong effect of latitude on fragmentation effects across taxa. And so is it possible then that the results of any triad study could vary tremendously depending where you are on Earth? And so just a quick advertisement for this study then, we're looking for studies that have all the sorts of data we need for a triad study, so that we can test these global gradient types of ideas. And the blue dots, I think, maybe slightly optimistically, are sites and people who have agreed to collaborate on this global study with us, led by Gianluca, here shown enjoying morel from a recent fire in Oregon. Another project we're really interested in comes from some initial work on exporting the environmental consequences of forestry. I think this is termed offshoring in the UK. And this was a paper I thought was really cool by Moran and Kinmoto that looked at the global environmental consequence of, in this case, this map is for US consumption on global biodiversity change, according to IUCN data. And there's been some really interesting recent work as well on how global biodiversity loss can occur as a result of these outsourced deforestation, or again offshoring the environmental impacts of consumption. So yeah, we have a postdoc opportunity. We just learned we had some actual funding from Oregon here at the College of Forestry to examine some of these issues. So an advertisement to any of you looking for a postdoc opportunity who'd like to learn cool PowerPoint skills like I just showed you. Yeah, you're welcome to come to Oregon and work with us. Please think about applying. So with that, I'll conclude. Global demand for wood continues to increase, doesn't really show any sign of dissipating. So we need solutions. There are definitely trade-offs between wood production and biodiversity at stand scales from our intensive experiment that I showed you. Even subtle forest management can have severe consequences for biodiversity. So forest loss is not all, right? You can have just a degradation, even with native species being planted, or even no species being planted, that results in biodiversity decline. So we need landscape level planning to try and address these issues. And the triad approach is one option that is quite exciting, but it still hasn't been extensively tested. and we don't know a lot about the correct proportions and how that varies globally. So with that, I will stop, and I do want to thank all of my funders over the years. It's been really nice having grants. Hopefully it's not a thing of the past entirely. And then my collaborators, particularly in this presentation, Ziqiang Yang, as I said, is my remote sensing guru, and some other names you might recognize here, and then a fantastic lab. I'm really just a front man for people in the lab that do awesome work. So thanks for listening.
Thank you, Matt. Lots of applause. I don't know if you can see those hands coming up, people clapping. So we've got time for about 15 minutes for questions for Matt and discussion. You're welcome to put your question in the chat. I'll keep an eye on that, or to raise your hand and ask Matt your question that you have directly. I guess I'll start with a quick question, Matt. The models of the triad approach, or sparing and sharing, they all kind of end up in one snapshot of time. Could be quite a long time, could be decades, but many timber systems work at least across multiple rotations across centennial time frames. How do you think you can deal with that?
That's a really good question. The way we dealt with it in that paper, and I think I'd still recommend this, would be that it depends a bit on the response variable that you're interested in and the timing that's relevant to that response variable. So for example, with carbon, does it make sense to sum the total carbon difference over, the 150 or 200-year planning horizon? Or does it make sense to sort of weight up front the value of carbon in the short term? Because that's the duration over which we think carbon storage could matter the most. On the other hand, when thinking about populations of an endangered species, you might want to provide sort of sustainable habitat over the long term. So think about the degree to how often does that curve dip below and cross over in different treatments. Really what you want, I think, is a continuous flow of that habitat. You wouldn't want to sum it over the long term because, what good is a lot of habitat at 150 years if you go through a bottleneck with almost no habitat in 20, right? So I think the answer, unfortunately, is it depends a bit on the species, and it depends on the response variable of interest.
Thank you. Brendan, you got your camera on. Did you have a question?
I'll put Brendan on the spot for a minute. Yeah, quick, think of one.
No, I have one, but I want to, it's a little bit.
Brendan, we can't hardly hear you.
Let me fix that.
I tell you what.
I can ask a question real quick if that's okay.
Who's that? Is that Matt? Yeah, go on, Matt.
I'm trying to turn my camera on. Hi. I work for the Canadian Forest Service, and there are a number of folks grappling with some of these same issues, the definitions of forest degradation in the context of the EUDR policy. And I'm just curious if you're in contact with any of the folks here, because there are scientists who really want to come to grips with some of these same questions and would love to connect you with some. I'm just a fly on the wall in some of these meetings because I have a general interest in it, but there are a number of people who are trying to contextualize and understand, and how are we going to measure it and quantify it and track some of these, like what are the metrics? How are we going to measure it within the Canadian Forest Service? Because it's something that we have to address. And so my question generally is just, are you connected with some of those folks, given you must have Canadian contacts, you're from the Maritimes?
Matt, thanks for asking that. And my guilt is really rising as you asked it, because yes, I am in touch with them. Yes, we had plans actually for me to help with those definitions. But my life had suddenly got quite crazy here in the US as a result of, I don't know, you might have heard about a recent presidential election we had. And so I've had to actually decline temporarily, at least, from being too involved. But yeah, it's something I've wrestled with. My conscience is on it a lot. So maybe I need to make space for it. But it's true. It's, Canadians in particular do a lot of wood exporting to Europe and the US, and it's something that's going to have to get sorted out. And it's a fundamentally really challenging question because it depends on aspects like what is the appropriate baseline for quantifying degradation? Are we
Yeah.
going back to pre-settlement forest in North America, or what are we seeking to sustain? So it cuts
Yeah.
to the heart of some fundamental questions about what sustainable forestry is. And I know it's also incredibly politically charged, as you know, with companies in Canada lobbying for, as long as that red line I showed you is
Yeah.
stable and we're not losing forest, it's good. So, yeah, thanks for asking. You've given me pause. So,
I sent your manuscript to some of the folks. I'm like, you guys need to look at this figure, that exact figure. We've got forest area increasing and forest-dependent species declining. I think
thanks.
they're probably going to be looking to birds as an early potential quote unquote easy indicator, but I don't think a bunch of the decisions are made yet. So anyway,
Yeah,
people are
thank you.
ready to engage when you are, if you are. Just letting you
Great.
know.
Yeah, they're really tired of that manuscript, by the way. So it makes me kind of smile that you sent it to them.
All
Anyway,
good.
yeah.
Thanks.
Now, Brendan, did you have a question? We've got a couple others coming, but back to you, Brendan, if you have a question. You're still playing with your microphone.
Can you hear me now?
Ah, yes.
hmm
Ooh, I need a PhD to work my audio settings. So yeah, Matt, you can punt on this one. Thanks. That was a fantastic presentation. Really enjoyed it. And again, this is like big picture stuff because I would say I'm probably the least knowledgeable person in the room on the subjects you presented and on kind of global timber supplies and challenges. But if you were to like think about this, because you ended with like this big question, and we think about, there's a whole bunch of different things we could do or spend time and effort on, and thinking about which one pays the biggest bang for the buck, given, this just spitballing and you're not gonna, maybe you are being recorded, but we can think about genetics, we can think about improving efficiency of existing techniques, we can think about reducing waste, we can think about tech for how our wood is used more efficiently. And I feel like there's like a whole bunch of big buckets that will have impact on biodiversity depending on kind of where we drive our science, our interest, our funding. And if you could, has anyone done like a relative sense of what these different, wedges or approaches to meeting future timber supply? Probably people in the room. So, but if not, where would you put your money?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I'll start with a criticism, and that's that we've done, our field has done a bad job of thinking at broad spatial scales about these sorts of issues, both on the supply side and the demand side. So that as a whole is the direction we need to go. And it seems like globally we're going the opposite direction with various trade wars. But first, quantifying what the impacts are of consumption, as I mentioned, on biodiversity in different countries, and then potentially thinking about policies that could more in the direction of optimize how we grow wood in relation to its biodiversity and climate impacts. So I think that's a first really important step. Another one is on the demand side. What can we do to reduce consumption or be more intelligent about the way we consume wood, at least? I mean, the half-life of houses here in the US is very short. It's still only in the gray literature, but it's something like 50 years. So do we really need to build like 2,700 square foot houses and then rip them down at year 80, or could we build, Sistine chapels? So there's some interesting work to be done on that demand side as well, I think. Yeah, and then of course, growing wood more efficiently, but we're definitely getting very good at growing wood intensively now. So I'd be looking less toward that. Another direction that is sort of, I guess, my soapbox is that in many parts of the world, we don't really even know what ecological forestry looks like. You would think, the Northwest has been the hotbed of controversy and forestry since the days of the spotted owl 40 years ago. And there's still almost no data on different non-intensive approaches to forestry and biodiversity and even yields. Like you can't find a yield curve for some of those pictures I showed you. So anyway, long story short, there's a lot to do. Brendan, thanks for the question. But I do think overall, and the challenge of this group is thinking at global scales is a super direction to go. And I think David Center is aiming on doing that, and certainly our group here at OSU as well. And some of Gianluca's work is already doing that. So
Great.
Great, thanks.
Thanks,
And
Matt.
then we've got Dom and then John and then someone in the room.
Hi, Matt. Thank you for a great talk. And sorry to touch on a subject that you might want to avoid, but again, we have seen a few headlines recently with President Trump trying to increase timber production in the US by 25% and opening up national forests to do that. And it's a bit unclear, well, to me, sat here in the UK, what that would look like from a practical point of view. And so I was just wondering if you'd be able to provide some insight into what that might look like, and also if there's any way of sort of prioritizing where that expansion and intensification might come from, or is there any way that can be done to sort of minimize the biodiversity impacts of that intensification?
Yeah, thanks. Really good question. Yeah, believe it or not, you're not the first person who said that a recent policy has unclear implications in the US. So you're definitely not alone in wondering what the outcome of these tariffs and the executive order to increase timber production will look like here. Really, nobody knows. I have friends in the Forest Service just a couple hundred meters away from me here that don't even know if they're going to have jobs in a couple of weeks. So, how do you increase timber production to that degree and not have any federal scientists actually ensuring that production is done in a sustainable way? And actually, Gianluca led a recent letter to Science. I think it comes out officially today in an issue that makes the argument that if yes, it actually could be possible to increase production here. In the northwest of the U.S., at least, it's been very conservative how forests are managed on federal lands. No doubt that carbon and growing stock has been accumulating substantially over the last 40 years. So there is room to produce more wood within the U.S., which potentially alleviates pressure the U.S. has been exerting on other countries that, and in theory, could be more biodiverse than the U.S. So countries like Brazil and Mexico. And also, actually, the pictures I showed you of New Brunswick, most of that wood from Eastern Canada goes to the U.S. market. So there's some hope that it sounds counterintuitive, but there's some hope that a Trump policy could have a net global biodiversity gain, but it would need to be done properly with focusing on getting wood from existing managed forests, ones that were clear cut 40, 50 years ago that are now older. Certainly not going into primary forests, and we still have quite a few of those in the Northwest here and across the US. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question. We don't know what the effect will be. We're hoping that science will still be used in making some of these decisions, and so that we don't end up back in a place where we're overcutting again and harvesting primary forest again.
Okay. That's great. Thank you.
John.
Hi, Matt. Good to meet you online, at least after it should have happened many years ago. I'm increasingly in the UK context working now in the kind of policy science interface, land use policy, forest policy, and I'm pushing quite hard for policymakers to pay more attention to the land sharing, land sparing triad choices, partly based on your work. You emphasized in some of what you talked about the importance of looking at how these different landscape scale approaches might work across a latitudinal gradient. I'm wondering if there's another gradient we need to consider, which would represent quite a strong contrast between the UK and North America, because in the UK, the policy context is not how our existing old growth or second rotation forests are managed. It's much more about our policy for afforestation. Should we, of farmland or even land up in the uplands of more biodiversity value, should we be going entirely for if you like, land sparing, blocks of intensive conifer and blocks of broadleaf woodland, creating that kind of new native forest woodland habitat, or should we be going for more mixed approaches? in the kinds of forests we establish. How well do you think the existing data and models would apply to a country like the UK, where we are talking about a strategy for what kind of new forests we create?
No, that's a really good question. I hope you're not hoping for an actual answer. Um, but no, I mean, it takes on a really interesting dimension, doesn't it? Because you're also thinking about species that live in agricultural landscapes and have been declining, as far as I understand it, quite dramatically across the UK. So it becomes another axis in these sorts of simulation models that you could run. What's the, and then you get to the question of whether you value these farmland species more or less than woodland species. And I assume there are a bunch of species that are just non-existent anymore because there's been such a long history of deforestation and fragmentation in the UK. So yeah, I mean, what would I do if I were doing it? In small areas, growing wood more intensively would alleviate some of these pressures on other forests globally, wouldn't they? But I suppose if that comes at the cost of losing native grassland or native agricultural species, that's a tricky one. But at least from I'm a forest guy, so from a forestry perspective, I would think that in the temperate zone, having some intelligently implemented plantations to grow wood would not be a terrible thing to do. But it would be really fun to play with some of the techniques that I've talked about today to weigh those various conservation outcomes.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, John.
One last question from, is that Simran or someone in the audience?
We've got some questions.
Hi. Thank you. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much for your very fresh presentations. I have two questions. So the first one is when we think about the global timber demand, so not only the timber production, but also the wood quality. So how do you think the position of wood quality? Yeah, because it's a different species and also even the same species is a different quality. So how do you think the position of wood quality in your research? The second one is when you evaluate the biodiversity of your research, did you identify the flora and the fauna in the species level, and how to guarantee such kind of species identification?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So those are both really good questions. And the wood quality one we haven't looked at to any great extent, but my gut feeling is that when you're growing wood extremely quickly in some of these plantations that I've showed you, the wood quality does tend to be lower. And so, for example, you wouldn't use a 40-year-old black spruce from a black spruce plantation to make a violin. You could use it as a stud in a building, but because the grain is so much wider, less fine grain, it's not as strong and doesn't have the same properties. So it's an interesting frontier in thinking about triad, and it might be something that tilts things in favor of true triad. Having some more ecologically managed forests that have kind of shade-grown species, like say shade-grown red spruce, and then some more rapidly grown for different products. So no, it's a really good question. And then from a global perspective as well, we definitely need to take into account wood quality. What can replace mahogany from the Amazon? Maybe we really need to work hard to try and find something that replaces mahogany from the Amazon. But no, it's a good question. Don't have a great answer for you, but it's something we need to consider. And I think your question was about how we sort of validate identifications of things in our biodiversity surveys. And for this, we're moving toward actually using metabar coding to identify things. So that's proving to be more of a challenge because we don't have great DNA libraries for some of the arthropods especially. But all the species you saw identified in that particular study were painstakingly identified and then validated by our local experts here on moths and arthropods and bees, and at great expense. And the sad bit, as you know, is there's a global crisis, I think, in that we're losing some of our taxonomic experts. And yeah, our moth guy who knows basically off the top of his head 800 species of moths is retired 3 years ago and is now just pottering about doing his own mothing. So it's an issue. But no, it was extremely painstaking. Some species we could only get to morphospecies when it came to the bees. But the moths, I think we actually got to species for the vast majority of them.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, before we we'll close the questioning. Before we thank Matt one last time, I just wanted to say that the next presentation will be by Ida Cooney Sanchez from the Norwegian University of Life Sciences, and Ada will be presenting her really amazing work from Africa. She's probably put more tree plots in Africa than anywhere, and she focuses a lot on tree communities and carbon stocking and how those are changing with time. So she'll be talking on Thursday, the 5th of June at 12 to 1 o'clock UK time, and it would be great to see you there. We'll send out a link. But with that, Matt, that was such a great talk, really, really thought-provoking, and some really great answers to some exciting and big picture questions there. So thank you so much for taking the time, Matt. It's been a real pleasure to host you.
Thanks for the invitation, David. Much appreciated. I look forward to seeing the rest of the talks.
Great. Thank you. And we can perhaps have a catch up another time, Matt. That would be great to find a chat to chat.
Super. Sounds great. Okay. Bye, everybody. Thanks for the great questions.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, David. See ya.
Thank you. Thank you. 俄勒冈州立林业做得很好。